So our focus at Clifton College for our Lent term 2026 is about hinge-point assessments. We are looking at adaptive teaching across the whole year, and we are moving towards looking at really crucial assessments of all pupils and how we can best design them. I'm going to go over our college strategy and where we've been before, just to sort of set the scene. And then I'm going to explain a little bit about adaptive teaching as a concept, and then what we've done so far in this academic year. And then to zoom in on the role of formative assessment within the wider scope of adaptive teaching. And finally to zoom right in on our focus for this term, which is hinge-point assessment. Learning and teaching are intertwined. Teaching is contingent on learning having happened, otherwise teaching has not occurred. Learning can be defined as the ability to use any sort of acquired knowledge, understanding and skills when it is needed, and apply it to new contexts that you experience in your life. In order to do this, that information, that understanding, that knowledge, those skills have to be available and accessible when needed. And there are principles that underpin learning. A lot of them are cognitive principles relating to how humans learn, but there are also social principles in terms of teaching multiple pupils in the same space at the same time. There's a lot of cultural and structural conditions and social conditions that have to be met in order for pupils to learn successfully. Acts of teaching involving anything you plan, anything you implement in the classroom, anything you do with pupils' work, have to embody what is understood about the principles of learning, but also the goals of the learning. When we teach, we want pupils to learn something, not anything. So we have to be specific. We are basing everything we do at Clifton on the principles of learning. So we've got this visual which sets them out. At the bottom, we've got those social, cultural and structural conditions which are vital to have in place first. They are foundational. Pupils will not learn if they do not feel safe, if they do not feel like they belong, if they do not feel comfortable, if they do not feel like they can, if they are not able to think deeply because the environment is not set up that way. And then at the top, we've got the cognitive principles of learning. All human beings have the same three cognitive systems: attention, working memory and long-term memory. And there are limitations to those three systems. There are constraints that we have to understand in order to teach effectively. Clifton, with myself and the T&L team, which is about sort of 25 to 30 teachers across the school, across the college, have been working on this, which is our Clifton Compass, 10 touchstones of teaching. It's our categories of teaching acts that we want to see deployed effectively. We want to see teachers working on. Each touchstone has a descriptor, which is not shown on this slide, but for example, the descriptor for behaviour management is about behaviour management being proactive, preventative and positive in the first instance, is about teachers being vigilant and running the room, and then is about being discreet, direct and depersonalised when behaviour that isn't conducive to learning does happen. So the descriptors don't tell you what to do, but they do sort of set out core principles for that touchstone. And then every term we work on some more concrete strategies, recommend some concrete strategies that all teachers can focus on, that is relevant to every teacher in the college, whether they teach EYFS or Year 13, and then everybody tries to work on that particular strategy. And to adapt it for their context, which is really, really important. Teachers need to be translators and adapters, because these things are relevant to everybody, but they do need that taking on board and that development. So where have we been so far? Last academic year, we started at the bottom with the most foundational touchstone, which is behaviour management, which is part of those social, structural and cultural conditions. And we looked at some concrete strategies, and the two that we focused on the most were signal, pause, insist for when a teacher wants to get the attention of the whole class, and front-loading the means of participation. These two are probably the most important behavioural strategies in order to successfully create those conditions. They're sort of where you begin. Then we moved on in the second term of last academic year to looking at how do we start our lessons and making sure lesson starts are as strong as they can be in terms of there being prompt, purposeful activity for all pupils when the bell goes, when the lesson actually begins. That is accessible, that doesn't require a great deal of teacher input, so the teacher can deal with any sort of contingencies that are occurring at that time, so the teacher can actually circulate, live mark and give feedback. Then we moved on to looking at, in the last term of last academic year, participation and inclusion, because once you've got the social, cultural and structural conditions, and you've started your lesson on time, which is also a very good behaviour management strategy because it sets those expectations right from the get-go, then we need to make sure that all pupils participate, because memory is the residue of thought, and thought is driven by participation, verbal and in writing. So we looked at 10 strategies for participation, such as cold call, think, pair, share, simultaneous response, etc. These touchstones are set. We are going to work our way up from foundational to less foundational potentially. Obviously, the strategies that we work on every term don't fit neatly into one touchstone because everything is interlinked in teaching. We are going to keep working on these as the years pass because these are evidence-based touchstones. We will go back down to behaviour management. We will check our signal, pause, insist, our front loading, make sure there's no lethal mutations coming in. We will add to those strategies because there are other behaviour management strategies we can work on, such as potentially 3-30-30, Pastel's perch, for example. We're sort of drawing inspiration from Teach Like a Champion, from teaching walkthroughs, and from a variety of other evidence-based sources. So that's where we've been so far. And we're sort of pulling out, each academic year, we're pulling out the principles of learning that our termly focus areas most relate to and our touchstones that we're really working on that year in terms of the ones that are the most focused on. So this was the last academic year. Everything I've just explained to you really focused on creating those social, cultural and structural conditions, directing and sustaining pupils' attention with the signal, pause, insist, and the front loading, are optimizing our communication so they know exactly what to do and there's no confusion there. And the 4 touchstones that this really relates to are shown on the left-hand side. So back to the learning process, because we're zooming in on this academic year now, and giving the overview, which is it's all about adaptive teaching. So where does adaptive teaching come from? Where does it fit in? So inside my learner's head, we've now got a network of interconnected nodes, and this represents knowledge and experience of that pupil. It's organised and it's connected, and the number of connections and the nature of the connections obviously is really important. In order to build this network, pupils have got to think. They've got to think about the right things for deeply, frequently, and when they think, they make meaning and they link the new information to what is already there. And they make different links, and the more links, the more secure that information is. But the thought, as I've just said, is they've got to be thinking about the right thing. They've got to be thinking deeply, which is effortful and can feel a little bit difficult, which sort of sometimes puts pupils off. They've got to sustain that thought, and they've got to think frequently about those things in varied ways. These connections then help to build up that organised network, securing the new information, shaping the understanding by forming those concepts, those mental representations in their own heads, and also improving the efficiency and the efficacy of their execution of any skills. So new is connected to what is already there, and this is really important to to realise when we're teaching pupils. What is there already is quite an interesting thing to think about, because it reveals a lot. So now we've got the blue arrows, which represent that interplay between teaching and learning, because they are linked and we can't separate them. So when we teach, what we need to be doing is firstly enabling that deep, relevant, sustained, frequent thought. And obviously those social, cultural and structural conditions are really foundational for that. And the participation is driving that thought as well. We need to also direct that thought. We need to have learning intentions and success competencies. We need to be very clear about our procedural instructions so that pupils can then think really deeply about the content matter and the concepts that we're trying to teach them. So we need to enable and direct the thought first, and then we need to constantly reveal the meaning that is being made in each of our pupils' heads. And that obviously involves frequent and effective formative assessment. But in a class, we are not just teaching one pupil, we're teaching many, and obviously many more than I've been able to put on this diagram here. And in each one of those minds, new information is being connected to existing information, but the existing information is not the same, and the existing experience is not the same. And therefore the meaning that is being made will not be the same. It'll be different for all of them. And we've got to be aware of that, because that then drives what we do as teachers. Do we differentiate? Well, no, because differentiation involves usually different goals, fixed ability grouping, lots of extra work for teachers. What we really want is the opportunity that all pupils will be successful, but holding them all to the same high expectations and the same goals, and believing ourselves and helping them to believe that they can all reach those goals. And they may need different levels of scaffolding to get there, and they may need different feedback, but we treat them as if they are all, we enable them to all get to that success if they work hard. And this is adaptive teaching. It relates to teaching standard 5 and 6 particularly. Standard 5 is all about adaptive teaching. Standard 6 has a big focus on formative assessment, and there are various other subsections of the other teacher standards. And obviously teacher standard 8 is a lot about professional learning and habits of being a professional teacher. So at Clifton, this is what we've been working on this academic year. So it's spanning all 3 terms. We're trying to build up effective adaptive teaching at the college. So we start in our first term, which we call Michaelmas, and then moving on to Lent and summer. And this is this little visual here shows a learning journey, some pupils on a learning journey. On the left, we've got the route, and on the right, we've got the goal, the end point of the journey. So we wanted to make sure that we started in our first term with the orange. So we started with what are the learning goals for any particular learning journey. So we really worked hard on crafting good learning intentions and success competencies so that we could then design effective tasks that were aligned with those learning intentions and success competencies. So our Michaelmas focus was goals before tasks. And we wanted to make sure that that was really, really embedded. We're moving on now in the Lent term to eliciting evidence of where each pupil is now. What meaning is each pupil making at any point in the lesson? And those constant checks. And then we're moving in the summer onto the sort of turquoisey bit where we're going to be looking at, when we do all of this, these checks, is eliciting this evidence, what are our responses? And so looking at being able to anticipate and prepare useful resources and questions and feedback and advice and examples and non-examples and analogies, etc., or back pocket questions to deploy as to the pupils that need those various interventions. And this is all to help all pupils be successful with the same challenging learning goals. So the principles of learning that most of what we're focusing on this year relate to, obviously they do relate to all of them, but these three, particularly making sure that we're selecting the right information to be learnt and planning effectively. We're facilitating deep thinking so that pupils can process and work with the new information and make those connections. And then we are making sure we're constantly getting information back from each pupil as to what links are being made, what meaning is being made, is it what we expected, and how do we deal with that? And these are the touchstones, the acts of teaching, or the categories of the acts of teaching that what we're working on this year most relate to. So back to our Clifton Compass. So it's got everything we worked on last year on it. And then this year we've got our first term goals before tasks, looking at our learning intentions, success competencies and alignment, class tasks being aligned with those. And then this term we're looking at formative hinges or hinge-point assessments in the sort of wider context of ongoing formative assessment. And next term, we're going to be really focusing in on effective responses and teacher actions to those hinge point assessments. It's a little bit disjointed separating the assessment from the response, because I know formative assessment actually encompasses both, otherwise it's not formative. But we wanted to make sure that we had effective hinge point assessments habitually in teachers' repertoire before we moved on. And obviously we've got lots of very experienced and we've got lots of expertise in the college, so teachers will naturally be starting to respond and act in ways that are effective to sort of drive learning anyway, but we're going to just look at some strategies that could be added to that repertoire next term. And so obviously in the future we've obviously not worked on explanation and modelling yet, and that will probably be what part of what we work on next academic year. And then we'll be looking at the touchstones and doing a critical analysis of which one we need to go back to and what strategies we need to add, lethal mutations we need to check for, and making sure that everybody is super confident so that we can make everything as strong. So I put together a bespoke walkthrough for term number 1 this academic year. The walkthroughs are brilliant, and I know that Tom Sherrington and Oliver Caviglioli are very open for people to take the format and also take some of the inspiration from them, and so that's what I did. There we have this walkthrough for last term, which teachers could work through each step to make sure they've planned their learning intentions, their success competencies, designing their tasks, and then sharing all of that with pupils to support the tracking of progress. So adaptive teaching, so that was, I've sort of gone over everything from last year. This year we're looking at adaptive teaching. So it's my little visual here of a learning journey with the learning goals on the right hand side and the pupils on the left hand side, and the black wavy line showing the intended direction of meaning making and progress. You start teaching. Start your explanation, start a few class tasks, pupils start processing and being exposed to the new information, but they're making meaning differently. So the little dotted lines showing that some pupils are going away from that intended meaning. A few are on the black line, but not all of them. And the grey lines just show all of the rest of the pupils. It took quite a long time to draw all of them, and it would look very complicated. But in essence, this is supposed to show that all of the pupils potentially are making meaning in different ways. And there is the correct conceptual understanding that the teacher intends the pupils to take on board, the correct mental representations, which is sort of represented by the green dot on the black line. So how do we reveal where each pupil is and what meaning they've made, and what do we do about it? How do we bring everybody back to that intended meaning so that they can be successful in their learning journey? So let's say I cold call a pupil. So the blue box at the top shows the pupil that I chose to cold call, and they give me a response, and that indicates to me that they have an alternative conception to the one I intended. I can maybe give that person feedback. I can give them another example maybe that helps them to distinguish between the concept that I'm trying to teach them and what maybe they've had their alternative conception. I can give them a task to do. Let's say I give a think, pair, share, and during the pair phase I'm circulating and I hear a conversation between the pair at the bottom in the other blue box, and I can see that they also have developed an alternative conception. I can intervene at that point, and I can make sure that I give some advice or feedback or action that brings them back to the correct conceptual understanding. And obviously, the more and more we do these participation strategies, and we get pupils to reveal their thinking and their meaning by talking or writing, and we are actually listening or reading that, we can pick up on these things. And so that's why I'm really passionate in the first instance about making sure that our participation happens as often as possible. The ratio is as high as it possibly can be. The equity is there so that every pupil gets a chance to participate, and this is something that really needs to be in place. However, with the best will in the world, some might slip through the net. We don't have infinite time in lessons. So there is other things we can do. So we can see the dotted lines for the blue box at the top and for the pair at the bottom have now come back to the correct conceptual understanding. But for the rest of the pupils, and actually it won't be the rest, obviously, if you've got really high participation ratio and equity, it's not going to be most of the class that you don't catch. But some of the pupils, you might only realise they've got these alternative conceptions at the end of the learning journey when you give them a summative assessment. And obviously this is too late. Summative assessment is synoptic, it's looking backwards at the learning, it's retrospective, it's summarising what they've learned or maybe what their potential is, and it's interpreted the same way for all pupils. There are things we can do, obviously, in terms of interventions, but it's far, far more effective to do something during the learning journey while the learning is happening. And this is why formative assessment is so important. So just a little bit about terminology here. Assessment for learning is synonymous with formative assessment. It was another term which was introduced later on with the best of intentions, potentially has not been more effective than the term formative assessment, but essentially synonymous terms. Checking for understanding is not quite synonymous in my mind. I would say that adaptive teaching includes checking for understanding, but to me, checking for understanding is the act of revealing the meaning, and it doesn't explicitly include the response and the action, whereas formative assessment does. So formative assessment is a diagnostic form of assessment. It should be ongoing and frequent throughout the entire learning journey and all pupils as much as you possibly can. It's therefore prospective, and whatever you find out in the moment, there must be actions and responses. And so those consequences of what you find out, the things that the advice, the feedback, the actions, the tasks that you then give them must then cause learning, must improve learning. So in this way, you are forming the learning, you're helping it to form in the right way. Again, a reminder, I know I've already said this, but you can't do effective formative assessment if you haven't got high equity, high ratio participation. So those cultural systems in terms of, a general rule of no hands up unless the teacher definitely front loads and asks for it, if it's maybe an extension question, that you do as much pair work and as much everybody writes simultaneous response as possible. You don't want pupils who don't participate because you don't know what's going on in their head. So I really like, there's lots of definitions of formative assessment. This is my favourite. The process used by teachers and students. I like the emphasis on both. And again, I like the two things coming next, to not only recognise but also respond to the learning that's happening, the meaning that's being made, in order to make it better, to enhance that learning, and again, finally, during, while it's actually going on, while you can still do something about it. So, summarising, we want to elicit evidence of learning as often as possible from as many pupils as possible. We then need to analyse and interpret that evidence that we are eliciting, and then we need to take action, and not just the teacher. If we train our pupils to be responsive to the formative assessment, to know that when we ask them to do a think, pair, share, or when we cold call, or when they do a simultaneous response, it's not just for our benefit, it's actually for their benefit, then they can take action as well. So why is formative assessment so important? Obviously, I've already given quite a lot of reasons, and this graph is not a real graph. This is just to illustrate the main points. Formative assessment is really important because it improves the rate of learning of all pupils. In some studies, the rate of learning appears to be double what it is without formative assessment, when formative strategies are used for the right reasons and when they're used with fidelity. Also, the effect is greater for pupils with low prior attainment or pupils with learning needs. So it's a win-win to use this formative assessment as much as possible. And these are just some quotes that sort of illustrate that, that increased speed of learning, and also the fact that it's very, very useful and very helpful, more so for pupils with low prior attainment or learning needs. Although, again, good teaching for SEN is good teaching for all. Good teaching for EAL is good teaching for all. So the pupils that don't have these learning needs are not going to be, there's no detriment to them in any way. So this is, as I said, this is a win-win. Obviously, Dylan William is one of the authorities on formative assessment in terms of, doing a lot of research and a lot of writing and presenting on this, and so I've drawn heavily on a lot of his work, and his 5 key formative assessment strategies are really helpful in sort of summarizing what we're looking for. So and again, if we apply it to what we've been doing this year at Clifton, last term we looked at clarifying, crafting those learning intentions and success competencies and sharing them with the pupils frequently, so that the pupils actually interact with them and know what they mean and actually start to process the information that is within them. And then we're now looking at, so last term as well, we were looking at the green bit, making sure that we design tasks that align with those learning intentions so that the pupils can process and make meaning and links with that information. And also this term, I think we're still in the green bit, because activities that elicit evidence of learning are not just tasks, they are also all of the participation that you do, all of the formative assessment, anything the pupil says or writes elicits evidence of learning. And so we are looking at those hinge-point assessments, which are also within the green box. And the next term, we're going to be looking at effective feedback, effective actions, responses that teachers can do to help learners move forward. And all of this, the 2 blue boxes and the green box, are going to make sure that as we move forwards, pupils can help each other, can peer assess, they know where they're going, they know, if I talk to my partner, this is where they are now because this is where we're going and this is how far away they are and this is how I can help them. So we can activate them for each other, and we can also activate them for themselves, and they can be better self-regulated learners. So back to my visual and my little story. So I gave definition of summative assessment and formative assessment, and now I'm just looking at a distinction that I have made within formative assessment between what I would term continuous formative assessment and critical point formative assessment. So a critical point is a point in a lesson where if you had to ask yourself, have they got this? Can I move on? Can I not? You're probably at a critical point. As opposed to that, all the time, teachers should be doing formative assessment with high participation ratio. And I would define this as continuous formative assessment will always involve some pupils, so it's often asynchronous. It will sometimes involve all pupils, in which case it's sometimes simultaneous, and it should be happening all of the time. We should be constantly thinking, right, pre-planned, obviously think pair shares, cold calls, but also in the moment, I'm going to do a simultaneous response here, I'm going to do a call and response, I'm going to do tell your partner. So it's sometimes pre-planned and it's sometimes opportunity based. But if we have that lens, if teachers have that at the front of their mind, high ratio, high equity, then we're going to be doing these techniques more and more and more, and eliciting more and more evidence more of the time about what's going on in the minds of our pupils and what meaning they're making. So that's continuous formative assessment. But then sometimes, as I said, we have these critical points where we ask ourselves, do I need to go over this again, or can I move on? And then we can design a hinge point assessment, which will be all pupils at the same time, simultaneously, and we will predetermine what this point is going to be. And it will be based on a concept. So we'll decide what are the key concepts in the learning journey that I'm teaching at the moment, be they substantive concepts or second order. What are the threshold? Is there a threshold concept that I can revisit here and that I can actually really check? I can add to the understanding of that. So we design a hinge point assessment based on a concept that we have predetermined. We carefully plan and craft that critical point assessment, that hinge point assessment. We resource it. We make sure it has visual and verbal instructions. We make sure that we know how we want pupils to respond. So this is our focus for Lent Term 26, is designing effective hinge point assessments and really internalising the criteria that make an effective hinge point assessment and making sure that those criteria are fulfilled, whilst at the same time translating and obviously adapting for different subjects and stages. So we've called it Formative Hinges, Informative Assessment for Transformative Action, because we want that emphasis on formative assessment is not just assessment. So on my critical point line, on my visual now, we've got some other coloured dots. So the red ones are the alternative conceptions that I as a teacher have determined might occur in advance, and I have written answers which include these alternative conceptions. I really like the alternative conception wording instead of misconception, but I may use both. So we'll design ideally a format that works best is a multiple choice question, and the other answers, the incorrect answers, well, each incorrect answer will be based on a different alternative conception. So they're plausible, and the pupils have to think really hard. And also in the context of that, and in the course of the formative assessment before that as well, we've got the purple dot and we've got the sort of salmon coloured dot, which is not very easy to distinguish from the red. And these could be other alternative conceptions that we've not even dreamed a pupil could make. I've definitely had those experiences in my classroom where a pupil isn't getting something, and I've thought to myself, I wonder if this is what they're thinking. And I ask them, do you think this? And they'll say yes, and I'll be like, oh. So I really think this is all about putting ourselves in the mind of a novice. How could a pupil develop an alternate conception here? If they are novices, they don't know what I do, I've got to really turn back the clock and imagine that I'm in their shoes. And obviously, during a learning journey, there will not just be one critical point, there will be multiple. As a rule of thumb, in each lesson, there's probably at least one, but in a learning journey, obviously, there's going to be quite a lot. So again, to reiterate, we're now zooming right in on the key sort of focus for this term. This is a very important decision. Have they got this? Do they understand this? Can I move on? Can I not move on? And we really need to be sure of what the answer to this question is. So I used AI to generate a lovely visual here for a hinge point assessment. I quite like it. And then a definition of a hinge point assessment is obviously a type of formative assessment, but it is pre-planned, resourced, and then it's deployed at a critical point. And it's a very rapid assessment. It's simultaneous of all pupils. They have a concrete output. We're checking their understanding of a key concept. Crucially, so that the teacher knows the answer to that question at the top. Can I move on? Do I need to go back and reteach this? Do I need to re-explain this? Or have half the class got it and half the class haven't got it? Or is it split even more than that? And do I maybe need to assign some flexible groups and some actions for each group to follow? But it's based on immediate need. And that immediate need will be different at different critical points in different learning journeys. So it's treating all pupils the same, enabling them to all achieve success. And quote from Dylan here, obviously, the whole point of this is that this is a hinge point, and we don't just plough on like a steamroller, regardless of what the answers are to the hinge point. We actually do something about it to improve learning, to form learning. This is how not to do a hinge point assessment. And I put my hand up. I've definitely done this in the past. Does everyone understand? Everybody get it? Make sense? You know, that is like, I don't know, that is like speaking into a void. It is futile. It is not telling you what's going on in anyone's head. And I'm really conscious of this now. And then occasionally, if I do slip and I say this, I actually sort of stop and say, I'm really sorry, that's bad teaching. I shouldn't ask you that. That's a question that is not particularly useful or completely useless, I would say. So we don't want to be just asking these questions. And I've generated some scenarios as well, which I found quite, I wanted to sort of illustrate some ways in which this can happen. So I'll give you a minute just to read this. And there's a narrator. So obviously Miss Davies has allowed hands up, and a very confident child answered and gave the correct answer, and she is a bit relieved. Excellent. Smartest kid's given the right answer. Let's move on. The other 29 pupils, she has no idea whether they've understood it or not. Next scenario. And the narrator. And so pupils get to know what our habits are as teachers, and they get to know how they can actually avoid, I suppose, what they deem to be embarrassing or being sort of outed as not understanding. So yeah, we need to be really careful about how we need to be having concrete output from pupils so that we actually know whether they understand or not. And the last one. And the narrator. So this is a common thing. Any questions? Right, no, move on, boom. We haven't given the class any time to ask any questions. Conversely, we might say, does everybody understand, or do you have any questions? And we might wait quite a long time with tumbleweed blowing across the classroom and then go, okay, we'll move on anyway because it's just awkward. Or we might say any questions and get a sea of sort of nodding heads, or we would say, do you understand? Yes, we all understand, and we just move on anyway. So none of those things are effectively telling us what the pupils understand. So I won't play Dylan's video, but again, really useful. It's available on YouTube as a sort of summary of all of this. And again, this is his definition of a hinge point question. Questions that provide a window into students' thinking are not easy to generate, but they are crucially important. And I think this is another thing. It's very easy when you give a talk to teachers or where you introduce a termly focus for people to assume, oh, this is just another multiple choice question. Really? All this fuss for a multiple choice question? But actually, when you really delve into the construction of a hinge point assessment, they are really difficult to write, really difficult to write effective ones. And that is because they are so effective. So we've got to take the time. So there are criteria that make an effective hinge point question. They've got to be rapid, so ideally maximum of 2 minutes for all pupils to respond, and the teacher needs to be able to sweep the class with their gaze and analyse patterns and trends within a maximum of 30 seconds. So we're not talking about a detailed analysis of 30 different responses here with extended writing. We're pattern spotting. It's got to be simultaneous of all pupils. They have a concrete output, not just a self-report, yes, I'm confident, I'm a bit, no, I'm not, because self-reports can often be inaccurate and they're not a concrete output. It's the pupil's assessment, not the teacher's assessment. The instructions for a hinge point assessment and the format have to be clear and accessible, because we don't want pupils worrying about the format and trying to deal with a huge amount of stimulus material that's written at too high a level, because we're not checking their understanding of the concept we actually want to check. The ideal hinge point assessment is a closed question, although there may be ways to fulfill these criteria with something more open, and I'd be interested to sort of discuss this with people. Each hinge point assessment should be aligned with the learning goals and focused on one concept that has been specified from those learning goals. All of the wrong answers need to include misconceptions, so they've got to be plausible. the pupils can't just guess the right answer because all of the others are just silly. So we don't want that happening. Therefore, it's better to not have any superfluous or redundant answer options, although there is a line of thinking that suggests that if you have a hinge point assessment with multiple correct answers, that can be challenging and challenge the pupils to think deeply, and that can actually be illuminating as well. And obviously you need to then decide on valid next steps that are going to shape learning in the correct way afterwards. So it's got to be a valid question. It's got to test what it's supposed to test. So a lot of what's been written and in a lot of embedded formative assessment book and a lot of you'll see everywhere, if you look for hinge point assessments, you'll see pupils should not be able to get the right answer for the wrong reason because the others are just they're not plausible. However, I also want to add that pupils should not be able to get the wrong answer for the wrong reason. And this would be like if you hadn't given enough time, you were rushing them, the stimulus material was too difficult, too complicated, written at a too high a level so that they would just go, oh, fine, I'll just guess A. We don't want them getting the wrong answer for the wrong reason either, because then it's not informative. So I've designed another bespoke walkthrough for this term based on designing effective hinge point assessments. The details of this are in this term's CPD booklet. Each step has obviously descriptors to help. But it starts with selecting which learning goals the concept is going to come from and stating that concept, and then making a list of misconceptions that alternative conceptions pupils could develop, and also challenges they might have with this particular concept. Then design the hinge point assessment, resource it, and make sure, when I say verify it, check it against the hinge core criteria. Does it adhere to all of them? So those are 1, 2 and 3 are before the lesson, and then in the lesson you are deploying the hinge point assessment, and in the walkthrough details there's advice on effective deployment and what you could say and what you could do, and then analyse the pupil responses. And obviously next term I'll be designing a bespoke walkthrough for how to respond and how the teacher should act as well. So I realise that we've sort of stopped the hinge point assessment before we do the crucial teacher action and advice and feedback section, but we will have a third walkthrough for that. So by the end of the year we'll have 3 walkthroughs which put together are really foundational for effective adaptive teaching. So these are some of the sources of information I've used in preparing this INSET keynote, although I'm recording it now after the event. So yeah, thank you for listening, and I hope that's been